I don't care if they kill me tomorrow. That's what Richard Lee Tabler once told a reporter from death row. And now, that day is almost here. In 2004, in Killeen, Texas, Tabler carried out a series of cold-blooded executions, targeting people linked to a local strip club. He didn't just kill, he hunted. His first victim, Mahmoud Mike Ajaj, the club owner, was gunned down in cold blood, shot multiple times at point-blank range. Next, Tabler executed two of Ajaj's employees, Haitham Zayed and Muhammad Amin Ramouni, shooting them in the head and leaving their bodies lifeless. He wasn't done. His final victim, Lisa Underwood, was found dead days later. Tabler bragged about his murders, even videotaping himself driving past the crime scenes. He wanted to instill fear in anyone who crossed him, but his arrogance led to his downfall. Police tracked him down through a stolen vehicle, and when arrested, he confessed without hesitation, even offering to draw them maps of where he had killed his victims. At trial, he showed no remorse, telling the court that he deserved to die. In 2007, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. For years, he played legal games, at one point even requesting to waive his appeals, then changing his mind. But Texas doesn't wait forever. On February 13, 2025, Richard Lee Tabler will be executed by lethal injection. No last tricks, no escaping fate, just the quiet drip of the IV as the chemicals flood his veins before everything fades to black. Demetrius Taryn Frazier. In 1991, Demetrius Taryn Frazier was just 19 years old, young, reckless, and already on the wrong side of the law. But what he did to 60-year-old Pauline Brown wasn't just a crime, it was pure evil. On July 16, 1991, in Montgomery, Alabama, Brown was alone in her home when Frazier broke in, looking for money. But instead of simply robbing her, he dragged her to the floor, beat her mercilessly, and raped her. When she tried to scream, he wrapped a phone cord around her neck and squeezed until her body went limp. For weeks, the case went cold, until Frazier was arrested for another violent crime. A routine DNA test matched him to the brutal attack on Brown. When confronted, he didn't deny it. Instead, he laughed, as if the murder was nothing more than an afterthought. At trial, Brown's family sat in the courtroom, hearing every excruciating detail of what she suffered. The jury took just 90 minutes to convict him. When the judge handed down the death sentence, Frazier smirked. For over 30 years, he fought to escape his fate, filing appeal after appeal. But on February 6, 2025, Alabama had the final say. No lethal injection, no electric chair. Instead, he was strapped down, a mask sealed over his face. No last-minute delays, no more words, just pure nitrogen flooding his lungs until the world around him faded to nothing. Stephen LaWayne Nelson. Stephen LaWayne Nelson was no stranger to crime. He had spent years in and out of the system, his rap sheet growing with every robbery, assault, and act of violence. But in 2011, at 24 years old, he crossed a line that sealed his fate forever. On March 3, 2011, in Arlington, Texas, Nelson walked into North Point Baptist Church looking to steal. But for Pastor Clint Dobson, this wouldn't just be a robbery, it would be a slow and agonizing death. Nelson attacked the 28-year-old preacher, beating him mercilessly with his fists and an office chair, breaking bones and knocking out teeth. As Dobson gasped for air, Nelson suffocated him using plastic bags, wrapping them tightly around his head until he stopped moving. But he wasn't done. Church Secretary Judy Elliott was also targeted, beaten nearly to death, and left unconscious. Days later, Nelson was caught using Dobson's stolen credit cards. Police found his fingerprints at the crime scene, and even witnesses who saw him bragging about the attack. In court, he showed no remorse, laughing, doodling, and mocking his victims. It took the jury just 2 hours to sentence him to death. For 14 years, Nelson fought his fate, filing appeal after appeal. But on February 5, 2025, Texas put an end to it all. Strapped to the gurney, he felt the needle pierce his skin. The same air he stole from Pastor Dobson slipped from his own lungs, until there was nothing left. Marion Bowman Jr. She'll be dead by dark. That's what Marion Bowman Jr. told witnesses before carrying out one of the most horrifying murders South Carolina had seen in years. And on January 31, 2025, his own words came full circle as he took his final breath in the execution chamber. It started with an argument. 21-year-old Candy Louise Martin had just given birth and was dealing with a money dispute involving her former high school friend, Marion Bowman Jr. But whatever she owed, it didn't matter, because by the time the sun went down that night, she was dead. Dorchester County, South Carolina, February 17, 2001. A burning car, a trunk full of secrets, and a killer trying to cover his tracks. Martin met Bowman and his cousin, James Gadsden, for what she likely thought was a conversation. Instead, Bowman had already decided her fate. He pulled out a gun and shot her multiple times, ignoring her pleas for mercy and her desperate cries about her newborn baby. But it wasn't enough. He threatened Gadsden into silence, dumped Martin's body in the trunk of her own car, and set it on fire to destroy the evidence. Bowman thought he could erase what he did, but by the next afternoon, police linked him to the murder through DNA evidence. He was arrested before he could escape, and his own cousin, the man he forced to stay silent, would later testify against him. In court, there was no way out. The DNA, the burned vehicle, and Gadsden's testimony sealed Bowman's fate. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. At just 20 years old, his prison cell became his future. For 24 years, Bowman sat in South Carolina's death row, watching the clock tick. He filed multiple appeals, but each one was denied. As the years passed, he had no choice but to accept his fate. On January 31, 2025, there were no more delays, no last-minute appeals. Bowman was led to the execution chamber at Broad River Correctional Institution, strapped onto the gurney and prepped for lethal injection. At 6:42 p.m., the drugs entered his system. A few deep breaths, a few final seconds, and then Marion Bowman Jr. was gone. James Dennis Ford. Some people kill out of anger, others kill for money, but James Dennis Ford killed simply because he could. In 1997, he walked into a home, brutally executed a couple, and left without a second thought. The murders took place on August 18, 1997, in Jacksonville, Florida. Ford, then 35 years old, had a long history of crime, but had never done anything like this. Gregory and Kimberly Malnery were at home, enjoying a quiet evening, unaware that death was about to enter their doorstep. Ford forced his way inside, armed and ready. He bound and gagged both victims, beating them as they begged for their lives. He then shot Gregory point blank in the head, watching as his body collapsed to the floor. Kimberly was next. She tried to run, but he caught her, dragged her back, and put a bullet in her skull. The crime scene was a bloodbath. Ford thought he got away until a careless mistake sealed his fate. He had pawned items stolen from the Malnery home, leading police straight to him. His fingerprints matched those at the crime scene, and when questioned, he coldly admitted to the murders. In 1999, he was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. His lack of remorse only strengthened the jury's decision. For over 25 years, Ford sat on Florida's death row, fighting for his life, filing appeal after appeal. But on February 13, 2025, his time ran out. No more delays, no more legal tricks, just a cold needle, a final breath, and then silence. David Leonard Wood. For decades, the name David Leonard Wood haunted the people of El Paso, Texas. Known as the Desert Killer, he was responsible for a string of brutal murders. His victims' remains scattered across the desert like discarded trash. The killings began in 1987, when 6 young women, all between the ages of 15 and 24, vanished without a trace. Their bodies were later discovered buried in shallow graves in the Texas desert. Some skeletal remains, others decomposed beyond recognition. Wood, then 30 years old, had a violent history of sexual assaults. He had already spent time in prison for rape when investigators linked him to the murders. Witnesses reported seeing him with the victims before they disappeared, and forensic evidence placed him at the burial sites. When police arrested him in 1987, Wood laughed in their faces, denying everything. But during questioning, he slipped up, mentioning crime scene details the public didn't know. In 1992, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. For over 30 years, he has fought his execution, claiming he was innocent. His legal team exhausted every possible appeal, but the courts refused to overturn his conviction. Now, Texas is done waiting. On March 13, 2025, David Leonard Wood will be executed by lethal injection. The so-called Desert Killer will take his last breath, but the families of his victims will never forget the terror he unleashed. Percy June Hutton. Some murders happen in a moment of rage, but Percy June Hutton's crime was planned, calculated, and ruthless. And for nearly 40 years, it has haunted those who knew the victim. On June 25, 1986, in Cleveland, Ohio, Hutton, then 32 years old, got into an argument with Derek "Ricky" Mitchell, a man who had once been his close associate. But in the world of gang violence, loyalty means nothing, and Hutton proved that with a bullet. That night he cornered Mitchell, pulled out a gun, and shot him twice in the head at point-blank range. Mitchell never saw it coming. One moment he was standing, the next he was bleeding out on the pavement. Hutton fled the scene, thinking he had just silenced a problem. But witnesses had seen everything. One of his own gang members turned against him, testifying in court and laying out the entire murder. In 1987, Hutton was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. His lack of remorse shocked the courtroom, with Mitchell's family calling him a cold-blooded executioner. For nearly 4 decades, Hutton has been fighting his sentence. He's filed appeal after appeal, but Ohio isn't waiting anymore. On June 18, 2025, he will face lethal injection, his last breath marking the end of a violent chapter. Moises Sandoval Mendoza. Some killers strike without warning, without reason, and without mercy. That was Moises Sandoval Mendoza, a man who slaughtered his own friend in a gruesome act of betrayal. The crime happened on April 4, 2004, in Lubbock, Texas. Mendoza, then 26 years old, had been drinking and partying with Rel O'Neal Tolson, a 20-year-old man he had known for years. But that night, Mendoza decided that friendship meant nothing. Without provocation, he grabbed a knife and stabbed Tolson repeatedly, the blade tearing through flesh, muscle, and bone. Tolson collapsed, but Mendoza didn't stop. He dragged his friend's bleeding body across the floor, slicing and slashing until Tolson was unrecognizable. By the time Mendoza was finished, his clothes, hands, and the room itself were soaked in blood. Mendoza thought he had covered his tracks, but investigators quickly pieced together the brutal murder. A witness reported hearing screams, and forensic evidence, including Mendoza's bloody fingerprints on the knife, sealed his fate. When confronted, he laughed and showed no remorse. In 2006, Mendoza was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. During the trial, he sat emotionless, showing zero sympathy for Tolson's grieving family. For nearly 20 years, he has delayed the inevitable. But on April 23, 2025, Texas will finally put him to death by lethal injection. He gave his friend no second chance. Now, he won't get one either. Wendell Arden Grom. Wendell Arden Grom was looking for money. What he found instead was a deadly opportunity. On a quiet night in 2005, he stormed into a home, armed and ready to kill. By the time he left, one man was dead, and an entire family was left in terror. On April 10, 2005, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Grom, then 29 years old, had a history of petty crime and robbery. But this time, things escalated. His target was 55-year-old Henry Morrison, a man who never stood a chance against the intruder who forced his way in. Grom tied up Morrison, beat him mercilessly, and demanded cash. But Morrison didn't have what Grom wanted. Furious, Grom put a pillow over Morrison's face and shot him point blank in the head. Then, he turned the gun on Morrison's wife, forcing her to open a safe before fleeing with cash and valuables. For weeks, the case went unsolved until Grom's own greed caught up with him. He was arrested trying to pawn stolen jewelry from the Morrison home. Witnesses placed him near the scene, and ballistic evidence confirmed his gun was the murder weapon. In 2007, Grom was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. His lack of remorse horrified the jury, who took less than 2 hours to decide his fate. For nearly 20 years, Grom has tried to escape execution, but the clock has run out. On March 20th, 2025, he will be executed in Oklahoma's death chamber, strapped down as lethal drugs course through his veins. The same way his victim had no way out, neither does he. Brad Keith Sigmund. Brad Keith Sigmund was no stranger to violence, but on one tragic night in 2001, he took things to a level of brutality even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend. Fueled by rage and revenge, he slaughtered an elderly couple in their own home, a place that was supposed to be safe. The murders happened on April 27, 2001, in Asheville, South Carolina. Sigmund, then 42 years old, had just broken up with his girlfriend, Rhonda Lark. Instead of moving on, he decided to punish her in the most horrific way possible. by killing her parents. Sigmund broke into the home of David and Gladys Lark, waiting for them like a predator stalking its prey. When the couple walked through the door, he ambushed them with a baseball bat, bludgeoning them repeatedly. Blood splattered across the walls as the elderly couple cried out for mercy, but Sigmund didn't stop until their bodies lay lifeless on the floor. His attempt to cover his tracks failed miserably. After stealing their car, ATM cards, and checkbooks, he fled. But within hours, police tracked him down at a motel. When officers entered, they found Sigmund covered in blood, the couple's stolen belongings still in his possession. In 2002, Sigmund was convicted of double murder and sentenced to death. His lack of remorse stunned the courtroom, and the judge called his crime a brutal, senseless act of pure evil. For over 20 years, he has fought execution. But on March 7, 2025, South Carolina will carry out his sentence. Since lethal injection drugs are unavailable, he will face the electric chair, a rare but fitting end for a man who showed no mercy. Edward Thomas James. Some murders are so horrific, they leave an entire family shattered forever. That's exactly what Edward Thomas James did in 1993, when he invaded a home, killed a grandmother, and ended the life of an innocent 8-year-old girl. The crime took place on June 14, 1993, in Tampa, Florida. James, then 38 years old, was looking for quick money when he broke into the home of 62-year-old Betty Dick and her granddaughter, Toni Neuner. But instead of just stealing, he turned their home into a crime scene of unimaginable horror. Betty Dick was stabbed repeatedly, her body found in the hallway, blood pooling beneath her. But Toni suffered the worst fate. The little girl was bound, beaten, and strangled with an electrical cord. When officers found her, she was barely recognizable, her small frame covered in bruises, her final moments nothing but pain. James almost got away with it, but detectives found his bloody fingerprints on the doorknob and shoe prints leading away from the house. When arrested, he refused to confess, but DNA evidence sealed his fate. In 1996, James was convicted of double murder and sentenced to death. The jury barely debated. It was an easy decision. For over 30 years, James has fought execution, filing motion after motion. But on March 20th, 2025, Florida will finally carry out his sentence. He will be strapped to a gurney, the needle pressed into his arm, as the drugs take hold. Samuel Moreland. Some crimes are so monstrous, they defy explanation. In 1985, Samuel Moreland walked into a home and slaughtered 5 family members, his own flesh and blood. It wasn't a crime of passion, it was pure carnage. The massacre took place on November 1, 1985, in Dayton, Ohio. Moreland, then 30 years old, arrived at his girlfriend's house in a rage. Inside were 6 people, 3 adults and 3 children. By the time he was finished, only one had survived. Moreland attacked without mercy. He shot, stabbed, and beat his victims, making sure they suffered before dying. Among the dead were his girlfriend, Juanita Hawkins, 23, her mother, Sarah, 56, and 3 of Juanita's children, 7-year-old Karen, 6-year-old Kimberly, and 8-month-old Daniel. The only survivor was Juanita's 7-year-old niece, who had been shot in the head, but lived to tell police what happened. Despite his brutal efficiency, Moreland was caught almost immediately. The young survivor identified him, and forensic evidence, including blood on his clothes and gunpowder residue, sealed his fate. In 1986, he was convicted of 5 counts of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. During sentencing, the judge described the crime as one of the most horrifying acts of violence in Ohio history. For nearly 40 years, Moreland has fought execution, but his time is up. On July 30th, 2025, Ohio will put him to death by lethal injection. The last face he will see will be the executioner. Douglas Lamont Coley. Some people kill for revenge, some for greed, and others for power. But Douglas Lamont Coley, he killed for nothing. On April 7, 1997, in Toledo, Ohio, Coley, then 27 years old, hailed a taxi driven by 26-year-old Samar El Akhti. She was a hard-working mother, just trying to make a living. But when she picked up Coley, she never made it home. At some point during the ride, Coley pulled out a gun and demanded money. Samar handed over what little cash she had, hoping he would let her go. Instead, he shot her in the head and left her body in the driver's seat, the meter still running. For weeks, the case went cold until police linked Coley's gun to the murder. Witnesses placed him at the crime scene, and his fingerprints were found on the cab's door handle. In 1998, he was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. The jury took less than 2 hours to decide, calling the killing senseless and cruel beyond words. For over 25 years, Coley has fought to avoid execution, but the courts have shut down every last appeal. Now on September 24, 2025, Ohio will carry out his sentence. He will be strapped to the gurney, the same way he left his victim lifeless in her cab. Timothy L. Coleman. Timothy L. Coleman was out of options. A small-time drug dealer drowning in debt, he needed cash fast. On October 12, 1996, in Dayton, Ohio, he made a choice that sealed his fate forever. That night, he turned on someone he knew, 29-year-old Melinda Stevens, and what followed was nothing short of cold-blooded. Coleman forced his way into her home, demanding drugs and cash. When she refused, he pistol-whipped her, knocking her to the floor. But a robbery wasn't enough. He pressed the barrel of his gun to her forehead and pulled the trigger. The bullet tore through her skull, and she collapsed in a pool of blood. Coleman then grabbed her valuables and disappeared into the night. His carelessness caught up with him fast. Witnesses saw him entering the home, and his fingerprints were found on the murder weapon. When police arrested him, he showed no emotion, no remorse. In 1998, Coleman was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. The jury took less than 3 hours to decide. For nearly 30 years, Coleman has tried to escape execution, filing appeal after appeal. But on October 30th, 2025, the legal fight ends. He will be strapped to a gurney, injected with a lethal dose of drugs, and left to drift into darkness, just like the life he took without hesitation. Kareem M. Jackson. He lined them up and executed them just like that. They never stood a chance. That's how prosecutors describe Kareem M. Jackson's crime. An execution-style murder that left 2 men dead in a cold and calculated hit. The crime took place on March 25, 1997, in Columbus, Ohio. Jackson, then 22 years old, was a ruthless enforcer in the drug world, looking to send a message. His targets? Ann Toro Hunter and Terrence Walker. Jackson stormed into their apartment, gun drawn, and demanded cash and drugs. The 2 men complied, hands raised, hoping to walk away alive. But Jackson had no intention of leaving witnesses. He forced them to their knees, pressed the barrel against their skulls, and fired 2 clean shots, 1 bullet each. With the job done, Jackson wiped his prints, ransacked the apartment, and walked out as if nothing had happened. But he wasn't as careful as he thought. Witnesses had heard the gunshots, and police tracked the stolen money back to him. Forensic tests matched his fingerprints on the cash and items at the scene. In 1998, Jackson was convicted of 2 counts of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. He showed no emotion in court, sitting stone-faced as family members of the victim sobbed. For nearly 3 decades, Jackson has fought his execution. But on December 10, 2025, Ohio will put him to death. He will be strapped down, injected with a fatal cocktail of chemicals, and slowly fade away, just like the men he executed with no second thought.